modern Hebrew poem entitled "In That Strange Night" by Zelda. The past is not a piece of jewelry sealed in a crystal box, nor is it a snake preserved in a bottle of formaldehyde. The past trembles within the present. When the present falls into a pit, the past goes with it. When the past looks towards heaven, all of life is uplifted, even the distant past. Jacob has died. Joseph and his 11 brothers fulfill their father's dying wish that he should be buried in the cave of Machpelah, that womb tomb where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah are buried in the land of Israel. "Bring me home," he made Joseph swear he would. And so a great processional goes up from Egypt. Chariots and horsemen and dignitaries from Pharaoh's court accompanied them to Hebron. The text then says, "Vayir'u achai Yosef." Then Joseph's brothers saw. What did they see is the question. It's surprising to hear this verb that they saw. What did they see? And this is where the rabbis, with their imagination, illuminate the primary Torah text. Our sages suggest that the brothers followed Joseph in taking a side trip after the burial of their father Jacob. Where did they go? They went to the site of that pit into which Joseph's brothers had thrown him so many years before. The past trembles within the present. When the present falls into a pit, the past goes with it. That may have been Joseph's aim, but instead the brothers panic. They are flooded with guilt and fear. What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong we did him? So they send a messenger to Joseph, and they plant what is most likely a lie, or as Jacob says, our bar mitzvah Jacob says, an appropriate lie for the sake of peace. "Before his death, your father left this instruction. I beg of you, please forgive the offense and the guilt of your brothers who treated you so badly." But Joseph didn't go to the pit to remember how he was wronged. Most of our sages favor that Joseph was there not to reignite flames of fury and revenge. He went instead to remember how far he had come, and to recall the faith and the courage that he discovered in himself and in his God when he was at the bottom of that pit, not knowing what the future would bring. He went to say a prayer of gratitude to God who had sustained him. He went to bench Gomel to say the blessing for those who are rescued from danger. He looked up. From the depths of that pit, he looked up heavenward. When the past looks toward heaven, all of life is uplifted, even the distant past. That was his aim. While the brothers are fearful and throw themselves at Jacob's feet, saying, "Hinenu lecha avadim," here we are, prepared to be your slaves, Joseph responds instead with a theological teaching. He says, "Al tira'u," don't be afraid. "Ki hatachat Elohim ani," am I a substitute for God? You intended me harm, ra'ah. Elohim chashava letova. But God intended the unfolding of our story for good, in order to bring about this day and the survival of so many people. Joseph, like many we know who have suffered and survived, believes that God has a plan and arranges the unfolding of human history in mysterious ways we can never know, but always for the good. Now, I appreciate Joseph's optimism and I admire his ability to forgive his brother's hateful crimes. But truth be told, I reject his theology here. It may be true that if his brothers hadn't thrown him into the pit and sold him off into the slave trade and told their father that a wild beast had torn him apart, then Joseph would never have made it down to Egypt, and he would never have gone to work for Potiphar, and he would never have been imprisoned with the butler, and he would never have been called to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and he would never have rescued the thousands of Egyptian lives from famine. Moreover, the descendants of the 12 brothers would never have settled in Egypt, and they would never have become slaves to a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And Moses would never have risen up to break their shackles and to bring them across the Sea of Reeds. And we, their descendants, would never have known 2 delicious seders every year to tell the story each and every year, Dayenu. I do believe that one thing leads to another, that the past is not a piece of jewelry sealed in a crystal box. But I also believe that we get to choose. The brothers chose hateful, violent, life-endangering choices. And Joseph often, not always, but often, as he grew and matured in his spiritual aspirations, he chose courageous, compassionate, and life-saving choices. And God watches the unfolding of human history. God watches and waits and worries and wishes. Joseph the dreamer had dreams of grandeur and dreams of rescue. Perhaps God has dreams for us too. Perhaps history is humanity's record of God's dreams, fulfilled and unfulfilled. Tomorrow is the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He would have been 88 years old. How many more thousands of lives would he have saved from a famine of the soul had not a hateful brother planned his early death? Like Joseph, Dr. King was a dreamer too. He was only 34 years old when he gave the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, the summer of 1963. My grandfather was there to witness it. The year before, however, in March of 1962, Holy Blossom Temple brought Dr. King to Toronto, and significant funds were raised to support his efforts in the civil rights movement. We don't have a full record of King's Toronto address entitled Nonviolent Resistance, but Rabbi Plout took notes when he was there. And the following week, the Temple Bulletin shows Rabbi Plout's record. He wrote the following: "A splendid audience greeted the renowned minister, who was a guest in our Brotherhood Forum series. Dr. King gave a highly moving address, and his answers to the many and varied questions provided us all with new perspectives. Nonviolent resistance was the theme of his address, and this nonviolence and this determined mood was evident in his approach to thorny problems and even in his voice. Here are some of the memorable and felicitously phrased thoughts which I wrote down during his lecture. 1. Segregation must go, not because this is important in our struggle with communism, but because it is morally wrong, because it substitutes, and here King uses the language, the theology of Martin Buber, because it substitutes an I-it relationship amongst people for an I-thou relationship. A second phrase that Rabbi Plout notes and records for us, this one will be familiar to you: the long arc of history bends towards justice. This phrase, the long arc of history bends towards justice, is well known today and often attributed to Dr. King. He must have included it in many speeches of the day, but I was thrilled to discover that he addressed our congregation with these hopeful words: "The long arc of history bends towards justice." Where does it come from, and what does it mean? King took his inspiration from the 19th century transcendentalist, Protestant theologian, Theodore Parker, who wrote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the existence of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." Both these religious leaders, Parker and King, 19th century, 20th century, were led by hope and called upon our better angels. They must have been optimists to say that the arc of history bends towards justice, but we know it's not always true. Some leaders get more attention and power by saying just the opposite, that life is hard, that neighbors cannot be trusted, that our greatest days are behind us. Or in the words of Zelda, that the present is tinkering on the edge of the pit and will all go down with it. I don't believe Parker and King believed that simply by matter of God's design, the arc of history necessarily bends towards justice. Instead, the gift of God's moral law, first articulated in our Torah, does not on its own make this a just world. Torah is also not a piece of jewelry sealed in a crystal box. Torah must be brought out into the world and honed and polished and held and articulated and interpreted so that it can cast its beautiful light like a jewel, like the jewel that it is. Judaism does not pretend hard truths of human history. We don't pretend away hard truths of human history or of human nature. We know full well that life is often hard and not all neighbors are trustworthy. But we also believe, despite the trials of our history, we believe in our heart of hearts that the arc of the moral universe is as pliable as it is long. It bends towards justice when we make it so. And Rabbi Plaut recorded one more quote from King's address in 1962. He said, "Time takes no sides. Time is neutral and can be used either way. But time is always ripe for doing right." Joseph's brothers bent the arc one way because they were blinded by jealousy and fear. And Joseph himself bent it back the other way, not always, but often enough, because he was blessed with God's capacity to dream beyond himself, to dream of a life of meaning and purpose greater than his own little lifetime. This is the Jewish view. We cannot calculate the curve of the arc, but we can divine it by acts of conscience, by acts of commitment, long day in and long day out. I mentioned that my grandfather was there in Washington for Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And I've been thinking a lot about my grandfather, Ernst Lorge, Alav HaShalom, throughout the last year, 2016. I've been thinking about how heartbroken he would be to see how racial injustices and anti-refugee and anti-immigrant sentiments still plague us today, even after all of his efforts. My grandfather was sent out of Nazi Germany by Rabbi Leo Beck. He became a rabbi and wore the American chaplain's uniform in World War II and returned to fight another battle here in America, the fight for human dignity and civil rights for every citizen. So there was, in fact, a reserved seat for my grandfather up at the front with the other clergymen and community leaders. But Rabbi Lorge's seat was empty. Why? As he was making his way down the mall, well in advance of the speech, with thousands of others that day, he happened to be nearby when someone tripped or fainted from the heat, I'm not sure. It was summertime. The man fell and hit his head on the pavement, hard. My grandfather stayed with him for a long time, until medical professionals arrived on the scene. And it was too late for him to interrupt, God forbid. He was very formal. He wouldn't have disrupted the dignitaries at the front. And so I imagine the esteemed Rabbi Lorge heard the I Have a Dream speech through the microphone speakers while sitting on the hot pavement in the August sun with a stranger's head in his hands. Because time takes no sides. Time is neutral and can be used either way, but time is always ripe for doing the right thing. This is how worthy dreams are realized in our fragile world, in a world so filled with pain, so filled with potential for the good. One act of kindness or protection at a time, one act of reaching out to a stranger who is at risk or is vulnerable, one act of non-violent resistance, one act of conscience and conviction at a time, one act that draws nearer the fulfillment of God's dreams for humanity. So as we reaffirm the sacred task at hand, the opportunity for good that lies before us at our feet, let us say every day as we do this Shabbat, Chazak, Chazak, v'nitchazek. Be strong, and let us strengthen one another. Amen.